Hi, it's almost time for us to start, so I'm going to wait a little bit and we'll get going at 6 o'clock. So, for all those who have joined me already, thank you. And for all those who are going to join, welcome. Okay, let's see. What time is it now? We got about 5 minutes. Okay, so far nobody's joined us yet. Going to be reading a few chapters from Sheriff in a Small Town, the second book in the series. So this just recently came out. Surrounding me, you can see all my other books that I have written. So I hope you'll take a look not only at this one, but at some of these other ones that I've got. A little bit of everything. There's time travel in the Time Is series of 7 books. There's some shorts that are from a glimpse of my shorts and another glimpse. And those are a little bit of everything from humor to scary stories to just my thoughts on things. And then there's Gods and More Gods, which is an interesting look at the beginning of everything. I have some books on, let's see, what else have I got? Some mystery stories with Harry Prentice and Oliver. I have Soul Man, which was another recent book that I put out and has stories about a detective who is basically shoe-based. So something different. Gods and More Gods. The Reluctant Left Hand of God is religious humor. World Mind, where somebody learns how to control and change things just with their mind. So it's a little bit of everything and always looking for new ideas of things to write. I've got another time travel book called Artistic Endeavors, and I am working on the sequel to that, Artistic Encounters. So things are happening. Soul Man's got another book coming out soon, and that is going to be Rogue's Gallery of all his interesting villains. A moment. I'm not going to start till 6. That's what time I promised, so we'll wait a couple minutes more. But I'm looking for some more books to read. I've read some books from some other authors that have allowed me to do that. My favorite, or some of my favorites, are A Lady Came Knocking, Ledge of Creation by Steve Wolfe. There's Joe's Journey by Marilyn Riley. And I'll look up and see some others. My webpage is at WordPress. It's time is will be at wordpress.com. And that's got a little bit of everything. All my books are there. Some reviews of books that I've read and authors that I have enjoyed. And it's got my blog and little samples of my books as well as videos from some of my earlier readings. And we're approaching 6 o'clock, so we're going to be starting soon in just a moment. Let's see what the clock on the wall says, 5:59. We are 1 minute away, and I will begin right on time. So let me start my counter. We're going to try and do about half an hour's worth of reading today. So for all of you that have joined me and are joining when they do join, this is Sheriff in a Small Town. We're going to start with the second chapter, Mystery Man, and work our way through a little bit. The train pulled slowly up the steep hill. In the darkness of a cattle car, a man peered out. He recollected that he should be nearing the hobo camp, and at this point in the year, it should be empty, or nearly so. He dropped out and ran to the trees. He could barely see the camp a few yards away. Here he might find something to eat, a drop of coffee, possibly even clothes. At present, he was wearing prison garb of gray with a broad, dark stripe. He needed something a little less conspicuous. Rooting around the camp, he found a few items that would be useful later: a pocket knife, a few coins, a pot, and coffee. He went to a stream near the camp, filled the pot, and made a small batch of coffee. Checking around again as the coffee percolated, he found a small box of animal crackers. Meager ration, but it would fill the gaping hole in his stomach. It had been 2 days since he escaped the Virginia State Penitentiary. 2 days sleeping rough in the open, traveling by open boxcar where he could, or walk until he could hop onto another train. Now he was back on home turf at last. He wasn't safe, but he was in familiar territory. He knew the residents and their habits. He could do what he needed to do in relative safety. Blown into a corner of a makeshift habitat, he found a paper from a week ago. On the front page was a picture of Sheriff Stone, who had captured a dangerous thief. The sheriff had been doing his nightly round when he noticed a small amount of light shining from the second-floor window of the co-op. Making his way carefully up the back stairs, he surprised the thief trying to open the safe. The robber pulled a knife to aid in making his escape. He was foiled after a vicious attack that nearly cost the sheriff his life. It was only through the sheriff's consummate skill and determination that he escaped with only minor injuries. Once disarmed, the man was escorted to jail and sent to the state penitentiary. The man reading the paper opened the jackknife and slashed at the picture in a frenzy. Not content with defacing the picture, he burnt the paper, grinning as he watched the sheriff's grinning face burn away. This was the man he'd come to find. Thanks to the sheriff, the man had spent several years in the state pen. Of course, Rocky Stone hadn't been sheriff then. The sheriff had been himself. But it was Stone as a reporter who had unraveled the fact that Sheriff Lester had sent an innocent man to the electric chair for a murder that he had himself committed. Not even the glorious Sheriff Marvin Morgan had discovered that little fact. It had all been so easy, and he had given the murder and execution no further thought until Rocky began to investigate the trial and imprisonment of Joe Steckler's father. His own trial had been a sensation, especially since his accomplice was Joe's own dear, sweet mother. She had turned state's evidence, or whatever the hell you call it, in order to gain a lighter sentence. Her testimony and the evidence Rocky had brought forward had sealed his fate. Retired Sheriff Morgan and his daughter had also given evidence, so they were all just as guilty in his eyes. He was thankful to have received a life sentence since he'd seen the effects of someone going to the chair. Where there was life, there was hope, and hope was a chance to escape. He had been warned by the court that for his own protection to say nothing about having been a sheriff. He was sent to a penitentiary in another state to add to his own protection. He had done the worst thing a man in his position could do. He bragged of his crimes and that he had done so in such a way that it was clear he had been in law enforcement. Because of this, his life had become in danger. He had been beaten several times. He had started far more fights than had been started against him, though. Don't even mention Sheriff Rocky Stone, it would set him off. A few were there from the actions of that very sheriff, but because of his treatment and skill, they spoke of him respectfully. Some had recognized himself, and from animosity had blown what little cover he had. He had escaped thanks to the assistance of the prison nurse. Men laughed it out easily. She had become his dupe. Like most women, he had worked his charm on her. She had been seduced into becoming his accomplice. What had been her fate, the man didn't know, nor did he care. With coffee and something in his stomach, he felt a little better. Began the long trek into town. He had much to accomplish while it was still dark. The town was quiet. It was late and darkness had fallen over everything like a blanket. Lights lit the street, but they were few and far between, and shadowy areas were plentiful. In the courthouse, Talbot had been working late and was ready to go home to his wife, comfort, and food. He checked the doors, windows, and gun safe, assured himself that the cells were ready if needed. Lastly, he counted the emergency fund, $150.27. Counted twice and annotated the amount with his initials. Almost all had been supplied out of his and Rocky's pocket. Few people who knew about it or had benefited from it donated the rest. Looking around again, he turned off the lights and locked the front door. He planned on taking a final drive around town, then he would drive the squad car home. In the rear of the courthouse, the man clad in striped clothing was hiding behind a dumpster waiting. Since many in town would have recognized his distinctive good looks, he had made a false beard and mustache as well as dark glasses. Seeing the squad car drive off, the man crept up to the rear door. Memory recalled that in the hollow of a tree near the door was a casket containing a spare key. Sheriff Morgan had put it there at his suggestion so long ago it was doubtful he nor anyone else still remembered it was there. That is, anyone except for himself. Unlocking the door, he slowly opened it. Fortunately, the courthouse was empty since the door squeaked a bit. Edging in carefully, he grabbed the oil can and gave a couple of squirts to the hinges. Excuse me, sorry. Memory went back to his stint as Morgan's deputy. Even then, he had commanded a certain respect. Part was from Morgan's trust in him, and part from his combined good looks and his ability to get into the town's good graces. He'd used that ability well. Not content to remain a deputy, he had committed robberies whenever Morgan left town. At first, the people called the deputy, but when it looked as if the primary suspect might be Sheriff Morgan, people stopped calling. Nobody could believe that their honored sheriff would turn to crime, but nobody wanted to push things far enough to find out for sure if he had. With suspicions came doubt, and since nothing was done about it, the suspicions lingered in the back of their minds. When the next election for sheriff came around, those suspicions swayed the voting. Sheriff Morgan had intimated that he was tired and was going to run to it, but his name was kept on the ballot. He was voted out and Hank was voted in. Once he had been installed, suddenly there was no more robberies, even when he had to go out of town. This was confirmation of their suspicions. Town still respected their former sheriff, but the silver in his star became a little tarnished. Looking around, he thought about the good times he had had once he took over. Good at the job, the people appreciated his efforts on their behalf. Good looking, he had been treated as a film star. Never had to pay for his meals, had women at his beck and call, and as long as he kept things quiet, he could do and did do whatever he wanted. Excuse me. Everything was going well until that. And this is why I don't do live much. Everything was going well until that upstart reporter named Rocky Stone, newly back from the army, dug up a story on an old murder. Rocky's suspicion had been aroused because Hank pushed the case through quickly so it'd be over before Morgan returned. The case was ramrodded and the defense was not given all the information. This is what had sent Hank Lester to prison. Knowing the net was tightening around him, he had planned on his revenge years ago. Now, before they recaptured him, if they did, he would have his revenge both on the reporter who had uncovered the truth and current sheriff, Rocky Stone. Opening the door, he reached into a box and pulled out a flashlight. Everything was as he remembered. It seemed nobody ever changed anything except the sheets on their cells. He hadn't changed anything when he took office either. Not out of respect, though. It would have been required effort, and he didn't feel like putting that much effort into the place. In a box high on a shelf, he saw his old uniform packed neatly away, along with some of his personal effects. coffee mug, his personal logbook, pen case, all items had been stored and not discarded. Since there were some needed items left behind in there, he was glad to see it. His box was right next to Sheriff Morgan's. Morgan had rid the town of desperate gangsters years ago, and his following exploits were the stuff of legends. For a long time after becoming deputy to him, he had been lost in the shadows behind Morgan's halo. The town had held him in high esteem before his supposed fall, and his reputation remained, for the most part, untainted. People had forgiven and forgotten. As for Lester, the former sheriff, he knew he couldn't make a triumphant return and be the sheriff again. But he could make Rocky pay for sending him up. First thing he needed was money and clothes. He couldn't show up at the Y in prison garb. The light from the flashlight went around looking for the cash box. He opened the box to find the $150 and a few cents. He didn't take much. $20 was enough to get him a room and a couple of meals at the Y. On consideration, he felt time was not right to commit any crime, at least none that would be found immediately. If he stole from the cash box, Rocky would immediately investigate, and while he despised Rocky, he wasn't going to underestimate him. He'd read in the papers they were allowed how he had solved some interesting and even dangerous cases. Besides, he had Morgan as his father-in-law, and Morgan was fiercely protective of his attractive daughter. Pity that. She was one of the few who had never succumbed to his advances. Now Rocky and she were married, and one whiff of scandal on Rocky and Morgan would drop everything and help clear Rocky's good name. Reaching up, he pulled his back from the shelf. He ran his hand over his uniform. He'd never be able to be sheriff again or any law enforcement position. Under the uniform, he found an old wallet. He always kept a spare, and this looked like it. Inside was $50 in small notes, a bank card he couldn't use, and tucked along inside the lining a thin sheet of metal. This was what he wanted. He looked at it and grinned. Small but sturdy, flexible and thin, it had served him well in the past robberies he had accomplished in setting up Morgan. It would serve him well again. He crept out the door. First, he went to the Methodist chapel and rooted around in the basement. Nobody in this town would think of locking the church. It was kept open so people could worship day or night. He was able to walk in and go through their clothes closet. He changed, filled a bag with some more clothes, and headed for the Y. He had a fake Social Security card that a friend in prison had made for him. He could use that temporarily as an ID. Getting the room at the YMCA was no problem. They took anyone and didn't ask any questions. A quick hour's nap, and he was ready for the first portion of the plan. He washed, pressed his clothes, and ensured his fake beard and mustache would stay on. The facial hair masked his looks enough that he felt secure from discovery. Let me get another drink. Excuse me. In the small, I swear that's only tea. That's nothing stronger than that. I promise. It just, my throat's kind of dry. In a small town like this, a new person was vetted thoroughly, whether transient or there for the duration. The moment he set foot outside the Y, he would come under constant scrutiny. People would also inform the sheriff of who was new, and everything they could be known about him was diligently related. That is, unless the person was not exactly new, but someone who had lived there and returned. To pass muster, he worked to blend in as one of their own. Luckily, he knew the town like the back of his hand. He greeted the people with a hearty how-do. He stopped off for a drink at the pump outside the gas station, just like everyone did. He went into the pub and asked for an Old Guard beer. It was a local beer, unknown to outsiders. During his beer, he spoke about goings-on in town. In the diner, he ordered the daily special and didn't complain. The only people who ever complained about the food were out-of-towners. He went to the lake and talked fishing and the local fish for half an hour. People who saw him and spoke with him accepted him as one of their own. He was just someone who had gone away, but was still one of them in their heart. It didn't take long to be accepted, but just to be sure, he'd continue for another week. For the following week, he kept a low profile, but worked to be fully integrated into the town. That's not to say he wasn't concerned about the marshal's office coming around to see if he had come back. He figured that by blending into, he could stay as long as he needed to, as long as he didn't slip and reveal himself. He went to church and offered to augment the choir since they were a few people short. Fortunately, none was needed. His smooth tenor voice might have brought back memories to some of the local ladies he had serenaded. Seeing them to them had been one of the simplest ways he had found into their beds. He avoided questions of personal nature, only saying that he had decided to come home for a while. A person who was so in tune with the town was readily accepted, and no further inquiry was needed. He was left alone without question. His arrival and stay were so accepted that they didn't bother reporting anything to the sheriff's office. For a couple of days, he stayed in a small blind outside the town. It hadn't been used for a long time, and he wanted it to look as though it had been. Fresh grass on the mound used as a bed, fresh cans of food on the shelves, coffee inside the coffee pot, all added to the illusion that the blind was in use. He went out to an old acquaintance on the edge of town. He had recently gotten out and had requested him to suggest a good place to hide. Recommending a place outside town that he'd heard was not being used, he instructed them how to get inside. He planned on using the place as well, since he could have all the comforts of home there. Later that afternoon, he was seated at a table to a sumptuous feast. After all the time on prison fare, the simple meal of beef shank and homemade noodles was more than welcome. Looking around at the comfortable home and his friend had cleaned and gotten ready, he felt more relaxed than he had for a long time. Under the influence of a good, sustaining meal, his mind sharpened and his cunning deepened. He was ready for the next part of his plan. In the courthouse, Rocky was fixated on the facts. Talbot entered from his round and saw Rocky still in the same position as when he had left. "What you got, Rocky?" "You were staring at that fax when I went to do my round." Rocky handed over the fax. An escaped prisoner was nothing new, and the name of Hank Lester meant nothing to him. People didn't talk about Hank. He was considered better off forgotten. He hung the paper on the board and sat down for a breather. Rocky seemed to be in such a trance that Talbot got curious. As Talbot thought more about it, the name Hank Lester was suddenly surprisingly familiar. He'd heard or seen the name before, and here in the courthouse, too. Rising, he went in the back room, and sure enough, on the top shelf was the box with Lester's name on it. Looking inside, he saw the uniform and sheriff badge. He removed the badge and placed it on the desk in front of Rocky. Rocky understood what Talbot was intimating. He wanted the story, and Rocky obliged. When he finished, Talbot was incredulous. A guy like that was deputy under Morgan? Find it hard to believe. Yeah, it was even harder for Morgan to believe. When I first started investigating, he couldn't believe Lester had anything to do with it. He had to hear it for himself, and when he heard what Lester had said and his admitting what he had done, he was furious. I don't think he ever felt so betrayed. When he came back on duty, he did so with a vengeance. He felt he owed the town something. We worked on a few other cold cases together while I was a reporter. Then he took me on as his deputy. We had different ideas, and he had a few set-tos in the beginning because of it. Eventually, I was able to learn his respect and, more importantly, his trust. Talbot dropped the badge back into the box with disgust. Just as quickly, he pulled it out and tucked it into the desk drawer. Rocky smiled as he understood Talbot's reasoning. A man like that didn't deserve to be remembered as a sheriff. As the drawer closed, the front door opened. State Marshal William Bull Hampton entered with a firm step and very serious expression. As the marshal marched to the desk and sat down, he took in the entire office at a glance. "So you got the notice that your old friend is on the run. Just wanted to see if he came to town." Rocky shook his head. Marshal Hampton needed to be reassured. "Sheriff, I know your history, so I know you're brave and resourceful, but if he does come back, he's come back for you." Rocky leaned back in his chair. "Marshal, the whole town knew Lester, and I can't think of one person who'd shield him now that his secrets are out. If he did show up, word would get around so fast he'd be back in jail in a heartbeat. The marshal nodded, knowing that what Rocky had said was the absolute truth. His jurisdiction was one of the tightest communities around. Even the hobos who came round to help on the farms had a special place in their hearts for it and kept a constant watch to keep it safe. He got up and looked around once more. It always felt like stepping back in time when he came here. No sheriff had ever changed since it was first built, and it looked like Rocky and Talbot were determined to keep it as it was also. Maybe that was part of the town's charm, the sense of permanence. Not even the menu at the diner changed. They tried it once, and the uproar convinced them to leave things alone. A town lost in time, but the current world had broken through more than once and shattered the peace. Once they had pushed the real world back out, they picked up the pieces, patched a few holes, and things went back to the way they had always been. He was concerned for the sheriff, though. In prison, Lester had tried to become a model prisoner, tried being the operative word. It was all a mask, and everyone saw through it, everyone except the nurse who fell for it hard. Once in a while, his anger and hatred towards Rocky would flame, and he'd get into fights with whoever was near him. Those fights were what had sent him to the infirmary and under the tender eye of Nurse Evans. The man had that certain kind of charisma that women went for, and she had given him whatever he asked for. In the end, he had escaped, and she lost her position. To make matters worse, he had gotten her pregnant. If he felt any sympathy or remorse for her, he had placed it on the back burner until after he had gotten his revenge. Now he was loose, and Marshall couldn't think of any other place that Lester would go. He knew Rocky would count on the population and let him know if Lester had come back. Looking at Rocky sitting soundly, knowing that a man was coming, gunning for him, and still determined to do his job, convinced Hampton to stick around town and keep an eye on things. Before leaving, he borrowed the phone and explained to the officer that he'd be annexed to duty here. Rocky held out his hand to the marshal. For him to do this meant he was convinced Lester was either here or would be here soon. Rocky and Talbot would keep an eye out as well, just to be on the safe side. For the rest, he felt confident that the population would keep him informed. Let's see, we've got a pretty close to, let's do one more chapter. After the marshal left, Talbot sat opposite Rocky, trying to talk sense into him. Rocky, you've got to get the hell out of town for a while. I'll take Joe on it for a deputy. He's done the job before, and you and I both trust him. If you won't go for yourself, do it for Agnes. The intrusive thought of Lester capturing Agnes to get to him was a disturbing one. Rocky was convinced that and left to collect Agnes for a visit to see her father. Morgan had several times requested that Rocky come up and lecture at the college. Now would be a good time to do so. They left quietly, no fanfare, no one to see them off on their journey. They even took the train from Mansfield so no one would know they left. Supposedly, no one knew anything except the marshal and Talbot. Both men had been watching the courthouse and Rocky's home. Unfortunately, word went quietly around town that the sheriff had departed. It wasn't broadcast loudly, but there were rumors when Rocky and Agnes weren't seen in church the next day. For Marshal Hampton, it was an opportunity to find Lester. For Lester, it was an opportunity for a new crime wave to lay at Rocky's doorstep. Lester waited until the next day to begin, or rather the next evening. Until evening, he worked on setting up the blind, further to show Rocky hadn't left town, only gone into hiding. Rocky had once located Jack Wheeler, who had been missing from home. The man had made a makeshift blind in the woods. He'd heard the story from an inmate who had known Wheeler. Jack had shown the man his temporary home, and the man had stayed there for a while. He told Lester exactly where to find it. It would be difficult to find if you didn't know where to look. Jack's time in the military had not been wasted as far as camouflage was concerned. Even knowing where to look, it was difficult to discern. From Rocky and Agnes's clothesline, he took a few well-worn items fit for rough living and laid them around. Frying pan and makeshift stove were placed prominently. That evening, he determined to break into Rocky's home, only to find it secure and unbreachable, unless he wanted to break a window. Instead, he chose a few items from the courthouse of a personal nature and added them to identify who was using the blind. He added a large manual can opener to the mix. There's one thing he had almost forgotten. An array of canned food with no opener might make people question the reality. A walk around town he found near the rear door of the co-op. The thin steel glinted in the moonlight as he thrust the sheet between the door lock and frame. Years of practice showed as he was able to open the door instantly. Other doors opened just as easily. Upstairs in the manager's office, he went straight to the right-hand drawer, bottom drawer of the office desk. It may seem odd that he didn't go to the safe and at least check to see if the door was secure. The reason was that prior experience told him that they never used the safe. Combination had been lost years ago. Instead, they had a small lockbox in the bottom drawer that was what had fooled the thief the last time. Trying to open the safe, he had taken enough time for them to be caught. Pulling a paperclip from the desk, he bent it and made short work of opening the cash box. His time in jail had been educational. Convicts are always ready to teach their profession. He'd had experience before, but now was armed with knowledge of how to do the jobs right. Opening the cash box, he saw plenty of money inside. He took only a modest sum. Had he taken it all, it would have been suspicious, but only taking some, they wouldn't notice for a couple of days until they took the deposit in. He left surreptitiously as he arrived. He went to a few of the homes surrounding the lake and found some items in sheds to add to the blind. Folding chair, television tray, jars of canned soup and jams, even a freshly baked loaf of bread. It added to the atmosphere and would increase the impression that Rocky and Agnes were living a double life. In his temporary home, he began to consider that people would ask why Rocky and Agnes were leading a double life. What purpose would it serve? Rocky would have to have done something that would make it the possibility of having a necessity of found out, hence the need to acclimate to a life of hiding. He'd have to have done something so corrupt that would trigger a major audit. Meant another incursion into the courthouse. Rooting around the storage box, he found the small box contained sheets for writing tickets. He also took several reports that Rocky had handwritten so he could work on copying a scrawl. These sheets were only used in numerical order. Once written, they were held until either paid or sent to the state for action. If paid, the money was put into the bank and a check sent with a third copy to the state treasury. If a series of tickets were used from a packet with different numbers, then no one would know about it until those numbers came up. So if a sheriff or deputy were using out of sequence tickets, it could only mean they were doing so to steal the money. He used page after page of paper to get Rocky's difficult scrawl down convincingly. His signature was the most difficult portion, but he eventually mastered it. Setting a small fire out back in the fire pit, he carefully burnt the pages. He'd almost made the mistake of tossing them in the trash, but caught himself in time. The home they were using belonged to a man that was gone for a long duration. It is true that they might return for a weekend visit, but the odds were long enough that he felt they could remain undisturbed. Most of the furniture was still under sheets, and only those essential were uncovered. The convict would have preferred a more attractive partner in his enforced isolation, but she was under his spell and would never give him away. Besides, she was a consummate homemaker. She always cooked, cleaned, and did her best to make their time together pleasant. His only irritation was that she groused about being forever cooped up and only being able to go out late at night when nothing was open. All right, that's where we're going to stop. So that's it for today. Next, we'll start with the Marshall's facts and work our way to the end of this particular portion of the book. So I look forward to seeing you again on our next reading. I hope you'll be here with me. And then, meantime, be good to yourself and take care. So I'll see you on our next reading. The chat's always open, so you're more than welcome to leave messages and let us know what you're thinking. Ask me questions about my writings, my books, or anything else that you want. So Let me know what you think of what these books are, the readings are doing. So I look forward to seeing you again. Be good to yourself. Bye.